Hey, what's going on, everybody? James here, and we are back with another episode of the Satisfied Watch Collector podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 things you should know about your watches as a collector to be credible. And I mean credible in the sense that when you get together with somebody and you're talking about watches, you know your collection. Because again, my goal for you is that you know and love your watches. That's the whole point. And so to go deeper on that, you've got to know these things about your collection if you want to be able to do that and to be able to share and to be able to speak to the pieces that you have. And really just, it should be all part of your research in buying these watches in general. So let's dive into what these 5 things are. So the first thing is going to be the basic specs of your watch. So when I say basic specs, of course, there are a lot of different things that you could talk about, but I'm just really talking about the simple stuff, like what is the case size? What's the lug to lug? That's a really big one, and not everybody talks about it, but I do think it's really important as far as the fit goes. You should know the rough thickness. Again, it's not like you have to have it down to 13.2 millimeters or something like that. But you should know, okay, this is about 13, it's about 10. Like whatever the thing is, you should have a rough measurement of it in your brain at all times. Again, I'm going to give you a couple reasons why in a second, but these are just a couple of key things on the basic specs. And the case material, because that's another one. Like having a titanium watch versus a stainless steel watch is going to make a big difference in how it feels on the wrist. Like I remember when I bought my first Grand Seiko, it was a SLGH017, the Night Birch, and it was titanium. It was the first titanium watch that I had ever owned. And I was used to, like my first couple watches were like pretty large case size Rolex models that were steel. And so when you go from a steel watch to a titanium watch, you're going to notice a big difference in how the watch feels on the wrist. Like the titanium watch starts to just feel like it's not even there because it's just so much lighter. And there's benefits to it and all that. But those are just a couple of examples. So now why am I saying that you should know these things? I kind of alluded to it already. But as far as the case size goes, case size is going to be one of the biggest things in terms of the fit of the watch. And it's a good reference point to have. So for instance, if you've got a watch like I do, I've got my Sky Dweller that's a 42 millimeter case. That's one data point on the watch. So that I'm like, okay, I've got a watch, it's a 42, I know kind of how it looks and feels on me. That's important to know. The next piece, the reason that I mentioned lug to lug as being the second kind of important part of these basic specs on the watch is because the lug to lug will actually have a lot more to do with the fit than almost anything else, sometimes even arguably more than the case size. So for instance, again, the Sky Dweller 42, it's about 50 millimeters lug to lug. Now, I have about 6-inch circumference wrists, and that's pretty small. Like I've got pretty small wrists, so I know what that watch feels like for me. And I use that as a reference point a lot just because it was the first watch that I owned, first luxury watch really. And so as I kind of went down my collecting journey, I always had those 2 points as a reference. 42 millimeters case size, 50 millimeters lug to lug. So now when I get to another watch, say my Yachtmaster 2, I'm going to talk about it later in this video, even though the case size was 44, the lug to lug was still about the same 50. And so what that told me was, okay, it's going to be wider across the wrist because it's a physically bigger case size. That makes sense. But because the lug to lug is basically the same, it's going to fit about the same as what the Sky Dweller did. And so whereas some people may be intimidated by, oh my gosh, it's a bigger case size, I'm not going to be able to wear this, by knowing that lug to lug dimension, you also have a sense. So that's why I do think of the basic specs that I'm going to touch on today, the case size and the lug to lug dimensions are probably the 2 most important of the bunch because that's going to determine whether or not the watch actually properly fits your wrist. And I do want to touch on another thing on fit, because a lot of people will look at the fit based on the watch on their wrist. So they'll look down, they'll take a picture of it on the wrist from a close-up perspective. And I guess ultimately what I want to say is that's not always the best gauge of the fit, because you could have a watch that's, that looks kind of big on you, like that looks like it's maybe extending a little past the edges of your wrist. But then if you kind of do one of these, and this is a shout out to Tim Masso on this one, if you got to do one of these, or go to a mirror, stand in the mirror, and look at it from kind of like a side perspective, from a third party, if you will, you can get a better sense of if the watch looks too big on you. So, I mean, like right now I'm wearing my Omega Seamaster Pro Prof 1200 meter, and though the watch itself is like 55 millimeters on the horizontal axis, it's only about 45 on the vertical axis. So like the lug to lug on this watch is like 45 millimeters. That's really, really small. So like my wrist actually wears this very well, even though from a side to side perspective, it's super, super wide, like insanely wide. So I think that's why I'm starting with the basic specs in this way, because that's going to gauge the fit. You can also, again, kind of do those little like checks to see, and whether you're shopping at a dealer or whatever, you can do that. Go to, they'll usually have mirrors in there. So just go to a mirror and just do the wrist check, yourself to see how it fits on you. Is it going to be the right fit and feel and look for what you're wanting with the watch? So case size, lug to lug. Next, I mentioned thickness, because the thickness is going to kind of do a couple of things. One, it's going to dictate whether or not it actually will fit underneath, whatever types of shirts you wear, whether you're wearing, dress shirts or sweatshirts or jackets or whatever you're wearing, that will kind of dictate whether or not it can fit under a sleeve like that. Again, sweatshirts are a little more flexible. You can just kind of, fit it right over that, and it's okay. If it's like more of a jacket cuff, like a suit coat, something like that, or like a tighter like dress sleeve, you want to know how that's going to feel, because it's one of the most uncomfortable things when you have a really thick watch and you've got this kind of tight dress cuff and it's like pushing up against it and it's just jamming the the crown of the watch into your, the back of your hand or into like your wrist bone. It's super uncomfortable. So I do think thickness is another relevant one, and just for the sense of like how light do you like your watches to feel? Because again, as you get thicker, that thing's going to feel like a big honking thing on your wrist. Again, my Pro Prof is probably my thickest watch at about 15.5 millimeters thick, and it's a monster of a watch. And so this versus like my JLC Master Ultra Thin Perpetual, like it's a big difference. And so you just have to be aware of what those things look and feel like to know how it's going to feel. And that's why, like I say, material I do think also is relevant here, because you've got to know, like, okay, a steel watch is going to be heavier than a titanium watch, but a white gold watch or a platinum watch is going to be even heavier than that. And so knowing, is the whole thing, is it a bracelet watch that's platinum, or is it, like again, my JLC is a white gold watch, but it's on a strap. So even though it's heavy, it's not that heavy because it's on a strap. So like all of these things become really good, just baselines to be able to work from, to know what you're going to like, how it's going to fit, how it's going to feel. And then I do think it's also really relevant when it comes to being able to look at other watches. We're collectors. That's what we do. And so very often we're going to be looking at other watches through videos like this or conversations, whatever it is. So being able to know, okay, I'm seeing a Moser, or I'm seeing a Girard-Perregaux, or I'm seeing an F.P. Journe, and this is the case size, this is the lug to lug, this is the thickness, this is what it's made out of. Now all of a sudden, whereas you may never know, like if you're not able to see that watch in person, you may not really know what it looks or feels like, but now just with those data points on your watch, you now have a sense pretty well of what that's going to look and feel like if you would put it on the wrist. So that's one of the reasons why I think that's kind of the most important thing to start with, is those 4 specs: case size, lug to lug, thickness, and material. So again, not only do you have a reference point for what fits, you also have data points as you compare to other watches. And it's super helpful, like I say, when you're considering a purchase of, will this watch look okay? Will it fit me? Will I like the feel of it? And I think also as you get more into collector circles and you're having conversations with other collectors, and maybe like, some of the things that I do where you're guiding people along to finding maybe the next watch for them, then it's going to be nice to be able to say, oh, well, you have this watch and you know what that feels like? Well, actually, this has the same case size. Or actually, this has a similar lug-to-lug dimension on it. So if you can wear this one, you can wear that one. Like those types of things can be really, really relevant. I just think it's important as a starting point to know those basics. That's going to be a crucial one. So let's move on to number 2 in terms of the 5 things you should know, and that is the dial of the watch. Now, the dial is pretty straightforward because you can just see it on your watch, and you're like, well, okay, like what's the deal there? I think there's two things that you should be able to comfortably describe and articulate in some fashion. No, you don't have to be an amazing command of the English language, but you want to have something a little bit more interesting than just like, yeah, it's a green dial and it looks really cool. Now that's okay. In some conversations, you're just jazzed about it or whatever. Like, that's fine. I have those conversations too. But when it comes to being able to actually share about the watch, talk about the watch, understand the watch, which is, again, the most important part of what all this is for, is just knowing and loving your own watches, you should have some idea of what this is. So, for instance, my Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Perpetual Enamel. I talk about this a lot. If you've never looked at it on my watch reviews, you can see it up there on the page. This dial is absolutely incredible. It's one of the most beautiful dials, in my opinion, ever made in watchmaking. Not only I've talked about JLC before and why I think JLC has just from a dial symmetry perspective, like there's so many different things that I love about Jaeger-LeCoultre and their dial, design. But there's a couple things with this watch in particular that are really, really special, and that is the color and the texture. And again, I think those two are important. And then for a dial like this, you definitely want to have some insight into the process of how it's actually made. Because there are some dials that are just like a matte color, and that's it. And it's okay, well, they use a lacquer or, something like that. It's just kind of simple, and that's all there is to it. You can't really say much more about that, right? But in the case of this Jaeger-LeCoultre, not only are you having to describe this interesting color, which is not exactly blue, but it's not exactly green. It's kind of almost more of an aquamarine. It's like an in-between. And then, of course, depending on the lighting, sometimes you get almost like a minty kind of green. And then another lighting, you get almost a sky blue. And in other lighting, you get a navy blue that's got a little green to it. Like, there's just so many different shades that you get because of the next piece, the texture and how it's made. So being able to describe and have some of those color words in there, other than just like, it's blue, or it's green, or it's white, like having some of those words in your vocabulary can be helpful. Next is the texture. And again, the texture can be pretty straightforward. It's a matte white color, or it's a glossy white, so having a little bit of a descriptor in there. In the case of my JLC, again, there's so much going on the dial that it's like, how do you even start to describe that, right? So if you're looking at the dial, there's 2 forms of guilloche on the dial. So that's like on the dial base. You have a radial guilloche starting from the cannon pinion that goes to the outside or outer edge of the dial, and it's all the way around, so they call that radial. And then the other guilloche that it has is a clou de Paris or hobnail, or a pyramide. There's a couple different ways to articulate it, but that style of guilloche is actually in the sub-registers on the dial itself, or on the perpetual calendar itself. So you have 2 styles of guilloche overlaid essentially on the same dial, and that's just the color and texture. And then the process as far as how it's made, it's literally done by hand using one of these old school rose lathe machines. So basically you're making cuts. You have a flat dial base and you're just making cuts all the way around, and you're slowly rotating and rotating and rotating, and then you're making another cut inside the perpetual calendar sub-registers, which is why you have these two styles on it. And then not only are you doing that, but then you have enamel on the top. Again, enamel is a glass-based paint. And so essentially what you do is you have this powdered glass. They do it in all sorts of different colors. JLC is one of the brands that does it. Vacheron does it. Patek, I mean, there's a lot of brands that do it. I shouldn't say a lot. There are some. And then what you do is you layer it onto the dial like a paint, and then you put it in an oven. And some of the simpler dials, they call it firing. Basically, you heat it for a certain period of time, maybe 50 seconds, 30 seconds, depending on the dial, and that basically bakes it onto the dial base. And then what many brands will do is they will layer that so that you end up with these really interesting dial textures and colors, which is why I was kind of describing the color before. So having something around the process of how that's made, knowing, again, a dial like that can take 2 to 3 days just to make a single dial is pretty incredible. So being able to share those types of things about your watch dials just makes the story that much more compelling. And then of course when you see pictures of it, when you see videos of it, it just becomes even more interesting. And when it's on the wrist, obviously, and you're talking to another collector, you can share those things, and that is interesting from a storytelling perspective. But once again, that gives you the understanding that you need to know what the heck you have on your wrist, because that's a pretty incredible watch. So that is an example of the second thing, which is the dial. Now let's go on to the third thing, which is the brand of the watch. Now this might, again, seem fairly straightforward, because if I'm having a conversation about my Skydweller, I don't really have to talk much about the brand. Pretty much everyone in the watch space, to some greater or lesser extent, they're going to know Rolex. They're going to have some idea of what they're associated with sports and, movies and all those things and fine arts. Like, they know because they've seen Rolex does a lot of advertising, marketing, those sorts of things, right? So you don't really have to tell the story of the brand when you're talking about a Rolex, right? But if it's a less common or less known brand, you may want to have some things about the brand that you can share. My favorite example of this for myself in the collection is my Dan Reuter. And I'm featuring his sweatshirt today. I'm rocking the Dan Reuter Escapement sweatshirt. So Dan, if you're out there watching, appreciate you. Thank you for everything. Thank you for this. And so Dan Reuter is an awesome guy. He basically makes the finishing customized on all of his watches. He finishes the case, he finishes the movement, and then works with some parts, sourcing and stuff like that to just make these absolutely incredible pieces, and they're bespoke, right? So you can kind of customize what color you want the dial, what color you want the hands. Some of the layouts I think he's done some customization with. Engraving on the dial and on the back on the rotor, he's done some customization with that. So Dan is just a very, very interesting guy and a super, super genuine, down-to-earth dude. It's not a big brand. It's literally him doing all these things in his kind of workshop, essentially. And he uses all Swiss-made parts. He's based out of New York. Again, you can see it on the sweatshirt. So that is a brand that it's okay, I'm seeing this watch, and I've had that, right, where I've been at events and, either wearing my Reuter or have my Reuter with me, and it's what the heck is this? This is a really interesting looking watch, but I've never heard of Reuter before. What is that? And so being able to share, hey, Dan Reuter, he's an independent watchmaker out of New York. Everything is Swiss made, but he does all the finishing and polishing in-house. This is the type of customization that he does. Here are some of the pieces, examples of pieces that he's made. Here, just being able to share that, and then having the story, which again for me was a watch that I got basically right after I went through chemotherapy and was in remission from cancer. It's not only a cool brand story, but it becomes a really nice personal story, because we're as collectors, a lot of the things that we are drawn to is from an emotional perspective. Now, I personally really find joy, excitement, fun in being able to articulate why it is, that we have those emotional ties and things like that. But that's not the case for everybody, and that's okay. So a lot of the time it's a visual thing. They get to know the person who's behind the brand, and then that connection is made, and they're like, I've got to have one of these watches, and that's very much was the case for me with Reuter. And it was a group watch, and it's tied to Tim Masso and that whole group. So like there's a lot of story for me there with Reuter. But that's just another example. So that's a time when the brand is relevant to know. Just have a little 30-second elevator pitch or speech or spiel about what is the brand. Because I think we all do that, right? Like when there's something that we like, whether it's a household product or a food or a restaurant or whatever it is, it's like we like telling other people about it because we're excited about it. And sometimes our excitement makes them excited about it, and that's just how human interaction works. So like that's one of the things that may be interesting about brand. Okay, let's see. Let's talk about the next one. The fourth thing would be the complication. Like, what can the watch actually do? And this, again, may be pretty straightforward in some instances because sometimes, this is a great example, right? It's a dive watch. It's a time-only watch. In this case, it has, a timing bezel, so you can, turn the bezel, which is neat. But there's not a lot to it, right? Even a simpler one would be something like my Girard-Perregaux, right? Aventurine dial, very interesting, but it's just a time and date watch. So when you talk about like a complication, there's not a lot to that, it tells the time and it has the date on it, and that's all it does. But that's not always the case, and especially when the complications on the watch are not necessarily obvious, and someone who isn't familiar with the watch, they may not know how to use them if you didn't describe it to them. So for instance, I had a watch that was the Rolex Yachtmaster 2, and probably one of the most complicated watches on the market, like ever. It's just interesting. Essentially, it's a mechanical, programmable countdown timer made for regatta racing, so made for like sailboat racing, but just had a really interesting complication that, again, if you didn't know how to use it or what it did, like you would never know just looking at it. So basically, in order to get this thing to work, what you had to do was you unscrew the crown, first of all, and then in the first position, when you unscrewed it, you would just be in the winding position. So you could just wind the watch in that first position. The second position that you would pull it out to was like the setting mode. So basically, you were able to set what the programmable countdown timer was set to, and it has this 10 through 0 minute track on the dial. So in order to set it, what you would have to do is you would have to first hit the pusher at 2 o'clock to stop the chronograph if it was running. So that's pretty typical for a chronograph, start, stop. And then you'd have to reset the chronograph by using the 4 o'clock pusher. So standard for a chronograph, right? Start, stop, and reset. But to actually set the mechanism, what you'd have to do then is you would have to turn the bezel 90 degrees. It would have been counterclockwise. So you turn the bezel 90 degrees counterclockwise so that the Yachtmaster 2 text is over on the right-hand side. And then from there, with the crown pulled out to that first position, then what you could do is actually set the countdown timer. And so it had a little arrow on it that would point to the numbers along this minute track. And so you could put it from anywhere from 0 up to 10. And so just by turning it, it would move this little arrow across the minutes. And then as you got to 10 and you kept going, it would just retrograde back to 0, which was just kind of neat. So then you could set it to 5 or 8 or whatever you wanted. I would do 3-minute. I would wear it at the gym a lot, actually. So I would do like 3-minute rests between sets. So I would set it to 3 minutes. But it was just an example of like, and then once you got it set, then you could press the 2 o'clock pusher again, and then it would start the chronograph, which was your countdown timer, essentially. So that was just a really cool complication that if you didn't know anything about the Yachtmaster 2, you weren't familiar with the ring command bezel that Rolex, came up with, you wouldn't really have any idea about what that complication was. and it was just such a cool complication. I still, I ended up having to trade it in when I got my JLC, trade it with a few other watches. So, but I do think about it a lot. So if I ever am stopping my commitment to the only one watch per brand kind of focus that I have now, that may find its way back in my collection. We'll see. But for the time being, it was just a really, really fun watch. Great, like, summer outdoor watch. And again, the complication was so interesting, you wouldn't know that that's what it did if you weren't familiar with how to use it. So just being able to walk through all those things is really fun. And again, important for you to know to use the watch, but then also really fun to be able to share with other people, share with other collectors, showcase those types of things. So then that's why we have these conversations, because we're talking about what's interesting, what's unique, what's cool about the watches that we have or that we're interested in, and that is what generates excitement in these conversations. So a little bit of a social type of theme to the video today, but I think you're seeing where I'm going with this. All right, lastly, the story of why you got it. So this is number 5. Now, we all have different reasons for buying the watches that we buy. And when I think about, certain watches that I've purchased and why I purchased them, I have to be able to kind of jump myself back in time a little bit to that period in my life. So I think back to when I first got my Skydweller. So this was 2020. This was early in 2020, and the whole premise was I was turning 30 that year. So you can calculate my age now. You know how old I am. And so I remember I had a Fossil early on, and I had some Movados, later on after that. And then I consolidated and got like a really nice Movado. And I was like, okay, this is like real high-end, like premium luxury stuff here. And then, I started to get into a little bit more on the luxury end, Rolex, Jaeger-LeCoultre, like just starting to discover some of these brands. And of course, I mean, I was doing all the same stuff then that I am now. Like I'm looking at all of these things. How is this dial made? What's this complication do? Like all of the same things that I'm talking about is what I was studying and learning about back then. So, you start to get an idea and get a sense of like, okay, well, what are the things that I'm interested in? What are the dial elements, the design, the functions, all those things. But then it was really, why am I doing this? It's, yeah, okay, I'm turning 30 this year. And, a big part of it for me was I wanted to really shift my mindset around the financial side of my life, because at that time, growing up, it was always kind of like, yeah, I mean, I always wanted to have more. Yeah, I'd always would like to have more. I mean, it was never, I wasn't starving, right? But I didn't get everything I wanted as a kid, like ever. There were always things that was like, well, wait till Christmas and wait till this and wait till that. And so, a big part of me wanting to shift my financial beliefs about money was I've got to almost normalize having nice things in my life and then understand the financial steps or strategies or things like that, which make that possible. So that's why that was another big reason why, I worked for probably 4 or 5 years and saved and prioritized to be able to afford that Skydweller when I first got it. And so I think about that, and I think about, you're always at a different place. For some people, again, it's a milestone. I've talked about this before, or a promotion at work, or there's various reasons why we buy these little pieces of, mechanical art on the wrist. But having the reason and the story and remembering where you were mentally when you were wanting to buy this watch can be a really not only helpful thing for you as just a collector to reflect and understand about yourself and kind of know why you want certain things or what you're interested in, all those things. But it's also helpful to be able to look back and then be able to share that story with other people. So that's one of the things with the Skydweller that was a real big game changer for me. And I remember at first getting it, I mean, it was the most expensive single item that I had ever owned and held in my hands, wore on my wrist. And I remember working at, when I worked in the retail space for a long time, and I couldn't actually wear a watch when I was like in it. I couldn't do that because there was a food safety element and all those things. So that was a big part of the growth for me, was getting comfortable with, okay, I'm carrying this thing around. Maybe I have it in my pocket because I can't actually wear it right now. And I know that in my pocket, I literally have a watch that's worth, like a lot of money. And so what that helped me do was to kind of start to normalize that, like, it's just a part of my life now. It's just who I am now. And over time, that was a big factor in, again, shifting my personal beliefs about money, about finances, and also about what was possible for me as a human being. Because I do think, and it's unfortunate, and it's why I'm passionate about what I do with these types of things, I do believe that there are genuinely people that they see some of the watches that, I own or others own, and I'm by no means like on the high end of this. I'm probably kind of in the middle. But there's people who see those types of watches and they think to themselves like, I could never own that because I'll never make that much money, or I'll never be able to afford it, or I'm always broke, or whatever, like all those things. And I'm really passionate about that type of thing because I do think it matters, and I do think it's the reasons that we make these types of decisions are important, and they're relevant every single day. So those are the 5 things that you should know about your watches as a collector, because if you want to be in this game, if you want to be in this conversation and be engaging with videos like this, learning about the watches that you have, maybe going and meeting other collectors and things like that, the very minimum, you don't have to be Teddy Baldessar and know every Grand Seiko reference off the top of your head. Like, it's amazing that he can do that, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Teddy, and I've been to his boutique, and it's beautiful, and like, so props to him for what he has done in his community and in the watch space in general. So, but it's like, you don't have to be able to do that. Really, my opinion at the minimum is you should be able to do that a little bit with your own collection, because that is the baseline. And then if you want to go and study Rolex movement references in your spare time on the weekends, that is your prerogative if that's what you would like to do. So thank you for stopping by, and I appreciate you taking the time, to explore with me here. And if you find this interesting, do like the video, subscribe to the channel. I post new videos every week, and leave some comments. I'd be curious to know, what are the things that you always try to know about your watches? If there was anything that I didn't cover today, or if there's something I did cover where you're like, yeah, that's definitely an important piece, let me know, because I would love to understand kind of your perspective and what your thoughts are on this topic. So until next time, everybody, thanks for being a part of this, and I hope you have a great weekend, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.